Good afternoon. I am sitting down again with His Eminence Archbishop Lazar Puhalo, who is the founder and the abbot of the All Saints Monastery here in British Columbia. Today, His Eminence wanted to expand to discuss this quote Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, used shortly after the Hamas attacks on October 7. It's a quote from the Bible that refers to one of the 5 genocide in the Old Testament. Excuse me. And the quote goes as follows: "You must remember what Amalek has done to you." End of quote. That quotation is invoking Prophet Samuel's order to go and attack Amalek, a tribe, and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, the Old Testament says, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. This quote was used by the South African legal team in late October 2024 in the genocide case that South Africa brought to the International Court of Justice, arguing that Netanyahu on October 28th, when he used that quote from the Bible, was inciting his soldiers to commit genocide in Gaza. Your Eminence, how to understand that quote from the Bible in today's action by Israel in Gaza, and what is the meaning of that quote? Some commentators who defended Israel said, well, this is taken out of context, or it's not what it meant, it's not what most of the observers have seen, which is an incitation to genocide. How can we understand that quote in the context of the destruction of Gaza today?
You know, there's a certain nuance about why this war in Gaza began, because Hamas attacked Israel, killed a number of people and took hostages. And they weren't about to return the hostages, and they couldn't, bring back to life the people they killed. So Israel was bound to respond in defense of itself. But this genocide was totally uncalled for. Men, women, children, babies, starving people to death, and bombing the entire city, bombing hospitals and schools. Let's go back to 1947, when particularly Ashkenaz Jews started to return, mostly, and some Sephardic. But there was an ethnic cleansing that took place, which is also against international law, and the kind of genocide began. Many of the Palestinian people who are still in Palestine, the area that Romans, I believe, called Palestine, are actually the direct descendants of ancient Israel, ancient Judea. They were, when the Assyrians carried away people from the northern tribes, Israel, and the Babylonians carried away from Judea, they didn't take all the people lock, stock, and barrel. They took the elite, the rulers of the nation, and many of the priests. So it wasn't, if we talk about the mystery of the banished 10 tribes, well, that's kind of nonsense in a way, because the 10 tribes never vanished. It's the elite, the rulers, the upper class. They didn't go around and shut down every single village in the northern kingdoms and literally root out every single human being there and carry them away to God knows where. Some of them evidently ended up in Assam in India. But it wasn't the entire people that were carried away. So the ones that remained behind after the Muslim conquest, many of them became Muslims, sometimes just under for fear of death, and sometimes nothing mattered anymore because Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans. And when the Romans ordered all the Jews out of Jerusalem, all the Jews did not leave Judea and Galilee. Again, the people in Jerusalem itself, and particularly the rulers. So there are plenty of people left behind who were Israelite or Judean. And many of them did become Muslims. So a lot of people in Palestine were, if there is such an ethnicity, ethnically Jews, but they changed religion. So anyway, when the Jews started returning, and again largely Ashkenazim, the Palestinians who remained there were simply thrown out of their homes, driven out of their own country. So this ethnic cleansing went on. And together with it, there was sort of a genocide, exacerbated by the fact that the French and the English were using Arabs and Israelis as surrogate soldiers to fight their battles for them instead of fighting their battles directly. I think after the Battle of Fashola, the French and English decided not to engage each other directly, but they would use surrogates to try to destroy each other. Anyway, that's kind of an ethnic cleansing, and a slow-moving genocide began. So it was in the system from the beginning. Now, as far as the Gaza thing, Israel had every right to defend itself, and Hamas continued to attack it. I don't think they had every right to commit genocide against the people living in Gaza, to kill babies and pregnant women and school children and destroy the hospitals. But the Hamas did have to be brought to terms. Hamas is a terrorist organization, no question about it. And anyway, but let's go now beyond what militated the war to the actual genocide that's taking place. And I want to look at the genocides in the Old Testament. Moses committed absolute genocide against his father-in-law's tribe, the Midianites, and took the virgin girls into sexual bondage. It wasn't, however much you want to apologize for it, it was genocide and sexual bondage, sexual slavery. Now, I know that Christian apologists are more likely to try to talk down slide fantastic around these things. Christian apologists are willing to lie and deceive in order to try to justify things they don't like in the Bible. And they outright bold-faced lie about a lot of this stuff. To try to talk their way around these really negative things in the scripture. But the fact is, God commanded, according to the chroniclers, not who wrote these things down, God commanded the genocides in the Old Testament. They were divinely commanded genocides, according to the authors. And I don't know if the Jews, I don't agree with Jews because Judaism didn't even exist in the time of Moses and Joshua. But the Hebrews were less likely to come up with artificial justifications of these things. When a major tribe was running out of women to breed, because women were just breeding animals, well, still are to many Christians. But so you go and raid another nation, capture the virgin women, take them back for breeding purposes to replenish your own tribe. And basically, that's what was happening when the Hebrews attacked the Midianites. They needed more women for breeding stock, so they kill everybody and keep the virgins for themselves for breeding stock. And that happened. And then with the Amorites, well, there are always wars going on between these tribes. The kings like Zog and the others, they weren't kings as we understand it, they were warlords. Abraham was a warlord. He had a number of retainers. He could go to war to rescue the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, and as a warlord. We talk about kings, king of Bashan, the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah. These weren't kings, properly speaking, they were warlords. And they had maybe the title of milk or something. But the justification that's given for the genocide against Moses' father-in-law's and his wife's tribe, the Midianites, well, God commanded it. Why? But Christian apologists will try to dance on their feet, dance on their hands to try to talk their way around it. They were totally evil, they were demonized, they were possessed, they had to be destroyed, they were evil. Any children that Moses had with his wife, the daughter of the Midianite warlord, would have also been demonized and possessed. But the cold hard fact is that they needed breeding stock, so they went to raid a tribe, claimed that God had told them to do it, or the chronicler claimed that God had told them to do it. Liquidated lock, stock, and barrel, even babies, performed abortions on pregnant women by killing them, which caused an abortion for sure, and then captured the virgin women and carried them away into sexual bondage as breeding stock. That's what actually happened. Now, the people who try to dance on their heads to apologists to excuse us for talking away are lying, and they know they're lying. Anyway, that was a sanctified genocide, supposedly sanctified by God. And the genocide of the Amorites, God told you to do that, told, I think, Prophet Samuel, make sure nobody's left alive. And don't even spare. And then when King Saul wanted to be merciful to the kings and the warlords, Samuel, grabs a sword and hacks them to death. Did God really command that? Or is that what the chronicler says to justify it? And what the apologists say, particularly Christian apologists, say to try to justify what's completely unjustifiable. So this idea of genocide against anybody who you perceive as a threat to the tribes, later to a nation. I mean, Israel wasn't a nation until a little bit later. Comes down in the lure of the people's memory, the lure of the country, as being divinely inspired mass homicides, genocides. And I noticed, you can't help but notice, that now that a genocide is being carried out against the people in Gaza, some of the Jewish leaders, the Zionist leaders, are making reference back to these Old Testament genocides as sort of a justification. Christian Zionists who think that Christ has no power to return until the temple's rebuilt and until there's a great war in the Middle East, will justify these genocides also, and not necessarily agreeing with them, but justify them as part of the preparation for the second coming of Jesus Christ, part of the preparation for the Last Judgment, part of the preparation for, misusing the word apocalypse, but anyway, for the apocalypse at the end. So there's a justification of this genocide based on the Old Testament genocides and based on the necessity of genocide in order to have Christ return again. So this is a part of the really tragic, and I dare say blasphemous, part of this whole picture. Now, Bibi Netanyahu is trying to hold on to prime ministership because if he didn't, he would, like Donald Trump, if he didn't, he would be sent to prison because he's been convicted already, just as Trump has been convicted of 50-some counts of felony. So part of it is inspired by Netanyahu's desire to protect himself personally, his own personal interests. And part of it is Hamas made a very great mistake when they attacked Israel and took hostages. That was an aggressive act by a terrorist organization against a nation state, which has a seat in the United Nations and the world recognized state. So Israel would respond to that invasion by Hamas and to the taking away of the hostages in a natural way. That didn't necessarily militate toward an absolute genocide, an absolute destruction of the Palestinian people in Gaza. But the fact that we've heard those, and others, referring back to the Old Testament genocides as a sort of a divine justification for the present genocides, that still lurks in a way. And to the shame of Christian apologists who simply outright bold-faced lie about the whole thing to try to justify it. So this is part of what to look at is this whole picture that now you're bringing back into the cultural memory of the people sanctified ethnic cleansing, sanctified genocides on the command of God. People like William Lane Craig and some other these Protestant miscreants will go around and say, oh, well, it's divine command theory. Something can be evil and sinful, but if God commands it, it automatically becomes moral because God commanded it, and God can do no wrong. Well, by no means a new debate. I think Socrates had the same question about divine command of the Olympians, and he was rather upset by that idea, and I believe Plato had carried that on as well. Something is totally immoral, but if one of the gods does it, automatically becomes moral because they're gods. And a lot of times, Christian apologists, the ones who believe in divine command theory, evangelicals, will say, oh, well, it was immoral if it was done without God's command. It's perfectly moral if it's done with God's command. Now, some Israelis themselves will justify ethnic cleansing and genocide. Well, God commanded it in the Old Testament, so we have a sort of this divine approbation of genocide. So we'll go ahead and commit it. And that to me presents a problem. And a part of the problem is the fraudulence of evangelicals who hold to divine command theory and evangelical or all Christian apologists who just tell bald-faced lies about things in the Old Testament, hoping to justify them or cover up for the fact that the Old Testament isn't the infallible, perfect voice of God. It isn't. It has too many mistakes, too many contradictions. Sun never stood still for anybody. But the fact that hyper-religious people are willing to just outright lie and deceive in order to explain away embarrassing issues in their own holy book is very telling. This happens with the Old Testament, mostly, of course, has a long, long history of it. But the very fact that some people can now try to justify the genocide in Gaza by the genocide of the Amalekites and the Midianites is frightening, to say the least. You know, you can go back, to the genocides that practically every nation at one time or another committed, and try to justify it if you think that it was divinely inspired or on divine command, whether it was Tor, Wotan, or Yahweh. And the fact that apologists will just dance on their heads and tell lies about it to try to justify it is unnerving. But the fact that it is being used, even in shadowy ways, to justify the current genocide, to justify the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, many of whom are direct descendants of the Hebrews, of the Israelites, is shows you to what extent our national ego and personal ego can create the most horrendous crimes, things sometimes beyond description. But let's go back to the fall in the Garden of Eden, which is certainly not a historical recollection, but it does give us an insight into the birth of ego. When we're willing to accept a counterfeit from Satan for something God has already given us, because Satan's counterfeit offers some kind of power, some kind of self-justification. So the birth of ego is what we're seeing in the story of the fall of Adam and Eve, story of Cain and Abel, when Cain, his offended ego, leads him to kill his brother. And we also have national egos. You know, the idea of a country or nation is certainly nothing new. It's very ancient in evolution, because animals would try to protect their hunting grounds, their own territory. So stake out your territory, and you know, a tribe of chimpanzees will kill another chimpanzees who comes into their hunting ground. Lions and hyenas fight all the time over the boundaries of somebody's territory or hunting grounds. Well, that simply morphed into the idea of a nation state, or city state, and then okay, this is Chaldea, this is our country. The Chaldeans conquered it from the Sumerians, and now we don't have quite enough of what we want here in our own country, so let's just conquer the next country over and take what they have. And so one tribal staked out territory is going to take over another tribe's staked out territory, hunting grounds, and that's going to be the birth of empires. And this is the same now. There's this boundary of, even though a lot of it's imaginary, the boundary of ancient Israel, the boundaries of King David's empire. He was never king of Israel. It became part of the Judean Empire under David. So then he was really a sort of a warlord emperor of these territories. You've got this national ego now that builds up, and you can justify almost anything on the basis of your national ego and the individual ego that it's based on. And so conquering the neighbors and killing them off and taking the best cropland, or taking whatever they've got that you want, is part of this development of ego from the time of the Garden of Eden forward. That's really chronicled. And this idea that genocide and ethnic cleansing are justified, but they're justified by your ego, they're not justified by anything else. Then chroniclers will say, whether God commanded or not doesn't make any difference. The chroniclers will say that he did, because the chronicler's first duty is to aggrandize his warlord leader and his tribe. So they'll tell the story so that it's with a positive slant on their own and a negative slant on the other. But the fact that these ancient genocides are even recalled in relationship to modern genocides and used as a kind of shadow justification is very frightening, and it's something that international law can't really tolerate. We couldn't have international law if we allowed these exceptions.
How much of this condoning by the Holy Book is carried over the Christianity? So you can say, well, this is the Old Testament, it belongs to the Jewish Bible.
No.
Christianity is not only the Jewish Bible, it's also the Gospel, the New Testament as well. How do Christians look at this? Is it something that belongs to the past and doesn't have, a doctrinal validity?
No, I
or
don't think so. I think that, you're not going to, it's part of the ideology of what we now call the Christian right wing, the ideology of Christian Zionism, and the ideology of apocalypticism, people who take the book of Revelation far too seriously and far too literally.
does the book of Revelation include
Yeah.
genocidal statements?
Well, the genocide of everybody who's not raptured, according to evangelicals. The rapture's nonsense. It's not really taught anywhere. But to those who believe in the rapture, they're going to be raptured. Everybody else is going to be genocided, no matter who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And since only Christians can enter into the heavenly kingdom, only Christians can be saved, there's going to be a genocide against all the Hindus. And they're all going to go to hell and burn for all eternity because they were born in the wrong place and didn't receive the gospel. They were born just in the wrong place. They didn't hear all that information. Might not have accepted it if they did. But the rapture leaves you with the understanding that there'll be a genocide against everybody who's left behind, but not that they'll all be exterminated, but that they'll all be cast into a fiery pit to suffer for all eternity. Because they weren't like us. They were different from us. See? And the Orthodox Christian understanding of the river of fire is quite radically different from that. There's no genocide implied of people who are left behind after some kind of a rapture. And but the religious justification of genocide is definitely there. Even in the 100 Years' War, we might have wanted to genocide all the Roman Catholics, and they might have wanted to genocide all the Lutherans and other Protestants. And you see that the justification of St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the Holocaust in the Auvergne and other places where the Bogomils, under a Western name, is still the Bogomils, the Albigensians and all, there was a genocide against these people, not necessarily because they were a different ethnic background than the other Gauls or French, and in the Auvergne and the other place, Languedoc, I suppose. But there was a systematic extermination of these people, which is a form of genocide. But it's perfectly justified by religion, by the people who held that religion.
Did the Saint Bartholomew massacre, do we know if there were references to the 5 genocide from the Old Testament as a validation of the killing?
Well, not the validation of the killings of the Cathars, and now begin to the Cathars or Bogomils actually, but we didn't. I don't recall that I ever heard that, but the genocide was justified by reference to God to stamp out heresy. Mm-hmm. And the 100 Years' War was certainly something that was blamed on God one way or another, one shape or another. I mean, I imagine that Gustavus Adolphus was a perfectly pious Christian, but it was justifying the slaughter of a larger percentage of the population of Europe died in the 100 Years' War between Roman Catholics and Protestants than died in the Second World War as a percentage of population. And they were killed in the name of God, justified by this religious idea that, and it really boils down to the idea that genocide is sanctified under certain circumstances. Mm-hmm. It's a sanctified, God-pleasing thing to do, according to the people who are carrying it out, of course. Mm-hmm. It's just like, you can't see that it actually, whether it directly figures into the Spanish Armada or not, the Spanish now they're going to not exterminate all British, but force them back into Roman Catholicism by destroying their nation. Unfortunately, the Anglican God was stronger than the Catholic God, so the Armada failed and the Anglicans won, the English won, but by an act of nature, by an act of God, you see. So God was against the Spanish and on the side of the English.
Mm-hmm.
These things, that sounds atrocious to say that, but you do some really deep contemplation on it. Well, how is this tied to Israel's right to commit genocide against its neighbors, sanctified by God?
Mm-hmm.
And we know, especially in the case of the Midianites, Israel was just trying to capture some breeding stock in the form of virgin women
Mm-hmm.
from the Midianites. We don't have any record of Midianites were doing anything negative to Moses, who after all was married to a Midianite, was saved by the Midianite, commonly called Jethro. He has, I think, 5 different names in the scripture. But the justification of the act of wanting to capture breeding stock in the form of virgin women, then to try to justify that as a necessary genocide on the orders of God, is what took place there. I mean, I can already hear some of Christian apologists screaming and tearing their hair out